Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Rob Udale, Public Research and Testing Lead in the narrative team at Animal Think Tank. And yeah, I'm excited to share our results and some of the things we've been finding. Hopefully, something there'll be something for you to kind of improve your advocacy and messaging about animal freedom. Oh yeah, I just want to warn that I am feeling a bit under the weather. So if I suddenly if the brain fog gets the better of me, hopefully Natalie can remind me what I'm supposed to say. Right, let's go. So yeah, kind of just to give you a bit of background about myself. So before working at Animal Think Tank, I was a cognitive psychologist, investigating basically how the brain sort of processes information, which basically meant spending many hours in dark windowless rooms like this, asking undergrad psychology students to press buttons on a computer. And by measuring their reaction times and their accuracy on different tasks, we could learn things like what are the limits on people's ability to think, um, how do people make decisions, and what can we do to improve people's cognitive abilities. And then about nearly 3 years ago now, I became vegan and very quickly wanted to get involved in vegan outreach. So I joined my local animal rights group in Chesterfield at the time and basically got involved in speaking to people on the street and kind of advocating for a vegan diet and lifestyle. And quite frustratingly, very quickly, I found that most people didn't want to listen at best. At worst, I was met with all sorts of kind of justifications for the status quo and, not very pleasant conversations. Probably something many advocates have experienced themselves. I'm sure I'm not alone. And so, yeah, it kind of led me to think or wonder, people kind of consistently come up with the same sort of arguments. So psychologically, there must be some kind of psychological process going on underneath. And I wanted to find out, is there a way that I can use my knowledge of psychology and research skills to help the animals? And yeah, it wasn't long before I discovered that Animal Think Tank was running this narrative research project. And so I've been at ATT for about a year and a half now. And yeah, basically the narrative research project, the aim is to find the most effective narratives for building public support for animal freedom. And, this involves kind of trying to figure out sort of what types of communication work. So how can we frame different issues? As well as, why are some people more receptive to certain messages than others? What is it about their individual traits or their personalities that makes some people receptive to animal freedom messaging while others are not? And just to give a very kind of high level idea of the sort of studies that we do. So we do some large scale surveys, but we also do message testing studies where we recruit a few hundred to a few thousand participants through online paid participant panels and split the sample up into several groups. And then each group would read a message or see a poster or a video that's advocating for animal freedom, protection of animals, or maybe something specific like signing a petition. One of the groups would just see a control message, and that message would kind of just be neutral and not really advocate for anything in particular, while every other group would see a slightly different version of the messages that kind of lean into different things and have different emphases. And then basically all the participants fill in the exact same survey, which means we can see are there any groups where they showed like stronger support for signing the petition or animal freedom. And the logic goes that if one particular group shows higher support than the control group, then the message or the video or the picture that they saw is more effective. And so one thing that we've discovered is that there are, in fact, many barriers towards people receiving our message. And this, not just from our research, but also kind of psychology more generally as well. Firstly, we've got a contradiction between our values and our attitudes. So when we survey people, we find that many people support like caring for animals. Is kind of obvious that you shouldn't hurt animals. So 90% of people would say it's morally wrong to cause harm to an animal. We've also found that I think 60% view eating vegan or vegetarian diets as kind of morally, a better thing to do for animals. But with this in mind, it kind of leads you to wonder, like, why isn't everyone already vegan? 95% of people consume animal products in some form or another. You might have heard of this as the meat paradox, which is kind of the state of kind of caring for animals, yet engaging in behaviors that harm them as well. And from a kind of psychological point of view, I see this as boiling down to the way people want to see themselves, the stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives we have about ourselves, is we would much prefer kind of to create a story about ourselves and society that protects our ego and our perception of ourselves as basically good people. So today, over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through a model that we've been developing that tries to describe some of the main barriers that we've discovered to people kind of receiving animal freedom messaging. And you can read this model from left to right. So on the left-hand side is we want to raise awareness about, the cruelty in animal farming or vivisection, and so on. And then going from left to right are the different barriers that people might encounter before being receptive to the message. So the first are psychological barriers, then there's perceived practical barriers, and then finally kind of assuming these first two have been passed as perceived effectiveness of change. Like, people might agree, yes, we should change, but is it going to do anything at all anyway? And I want to add, like, this isn't an exhaustive model. So kind of scientific models, they're always developing and evolving. As we run more studies and learn more information, we're going to be adding to this as time goes on. And so, yeah, the first psychological barrier is identity threat, which I've kind of hinted at a little bit already. So basically, self-identity is kind of how we perceive ourselves, the labels that we use to describe ourselves, like what type of person am I? And it's really important for our sense of self-esteem to the extent that we are kind of unconsciously motivated to protect our self-identity. So if somebody is told that they should go vegan, what they're really hearing is, you're a bad person. And some people might go, you're probably right, I should do something about that. But quite a typical response that you've probably encountered is rejecting the message or avoiding the message altogether. You can also have like do-gooder derogation, whereby the actual messenger is attacked. So these are some ways that people try to kind of protect their sense of self, what's known as positive self-image. And in fact, eating meat is strongly tied to identity. So this is an example of one particular type of self-identity that is like the manly meat identity. which is the idea that eating meat somehow like makes you strong and virile, and the only way to be a proper man is to eat loads of meat and kind of overcome nature, basically. And this is something that the advertising industry has tapped into to sell more burgers, basically. But also, meat is an important part of our culture and like our social identity. So, for example, that could be eating a turkey at Christmas, or having burgers and sausages around a barbecue in the summer. Like these are kind of rituals that we engage in to kind of strengthen our social bonds. And the idea of taking these things away kind of is scary to a lot of people. So evidence from our research of this kind of identity threat protection, we found that we've tested some messages that talk about speciesism and sort of say like, explain what speciesism is, that it's this kind of discrimination between animals based solely on their species. And we found that people who read these messages actually had lower support for animal freedom and protection than people who just read like a neutral baseline condition. And I think the reason for this is because basically what the underlying message of this type of message is that humans are bad. And since the people reading the messages are humans themselves, they might feel personally attacked. So by kind of, in order to strengthen their identity and not feel like I'm a bad person, it's easier to ignore the message and kind of um, push back against it. Having said that, though, this is something that's kind of ongoing in our research. So in some focus groups we've run, we found that people can accept the concept of speciesism in a kind of non-emotional way. Like they understand that it's sort of treating different species in an almost arbitrary hierarchy. But what gets people's kind of backs up is comparing it with other isms like racism or sexism. So I think there may be some subtleties to how this sort of narrative should be used. Another one is animal oppression. So in some of the messages we've tested, we've talked about how, animals are oppressed and that they should be freed or liberated. And again, we found that people who read these messages had lower support for animal freedom. And again, I think this is because it's basically saying humans are bad, humans are the problem. And yeah, like I said before, this is still ongoing research. So we have a study that's going to be underway soon, kind of looking at like, how do we frame the problem? Maybe it isn't oppression or speciesism. Maybe there is a way of framing the problem which people can find palatable. And then another strategy we took was, okay, let's just try and avoid identity altogether and sort of appeal to values. So we thought in a study that was looking at diet change, we thought, okay, people might have the values that are shared, that people might share values with vegans, like caring for animals and not wanting to do harm. So we wrote some messages that were about like saying, look, we're all kind of on a journey. You might not be vegan, but you could be vegan hearted because at your heart, you have the same values. And still, we found that people that read these messages had lower support for animal freedom. And when we looked at the kind of qualitative responses to this message, people said something along the lines of basically, oh, you're just telling us to go vegan, don't tell me what to do. And like, whether we like it or not, vegans are kind of a vilified minority. No one really wants to be a vegan. So I think just having that word in there already puts people off and sort of switches people off the message. However, I think there are some identities that work. So here's one that we have identified. We asked people whether or not they saw themselves as animal lovers, and we found that people who did self-identify as animal lovers were less likely to eat meat, and they were more supportive of banning factory farming, and they also had lower scores of speciesism. So that's identity threat. So the next psychological barrier is agency threat. And basically, agency is the idea that we have control of ourselves and our own decisions, and people really value their autonomy and their ability to make decisions, especially when it comes to buying products or the food that they eat. People really value their own personal choice. There's a concept called psychological reactance, which is if your sense of autonomy is kind of, if you feel that it's being restricted or impinged upon, there's a pushback against the person or the thing telling you what you should do. A recent example in my life, I got up to go and wash the dishes after dinner. And as I was on my way to the kitchen, my wife said, "Oh, could you wash the dishes, please, love?" And I felt this like, I don't want to do it now. You know, like, how dare you tell me what I should do? But there you go. I did them anyway because I am a grown up. Um, Pax Fauna, who are a similar research group to ourselves, have also kind of found evidence for the effect of agency threat. So they found that so either by kind of giving prescriptive statements like, um, oh, I can't think of any off the top of my head now, but basically they compared like giving prescriptive statements like go vegan versus kind of phrasing like rhetorical questions like, do you think it's wrong to do X, Y, and Z? People viewed these rhetorical questions much more favorably, and they felt that it left room for the audience to come to their own conclusions. And of course, yeah, if you phrase the question well, then hopefully everyone comes to the same conclusion. And we believe we've also found some evidence for the effect of this agency threat. So in a recent study, we've been testing the imagery and the headings in some billboards that are going to be put up on the London Tube. This campaign is not released yet. It's pending authorization. But basically, its aim was to raise awareness of welfare washing. That is kind of organizations putting their label on products saying these animals lived a good life, when in reality, their lives were pretty grim. And so we were looking at the effect of different headings and what effect they had on trust in these assurance schemes. So here's two examples. One was don't trust the label, while the other was high welfare is a lie. And what we found was that people who read the don't trust the label poster had a between 7 and 18% reduction in trust in the ability of assurance schemes to protect the welfare of farmed animals. In contrast, the high welfare is a lie message had no effect on people's trust. So people remained having fairly high levels of trust. And the way I interpret this is high welfare is a lie is like the conclusion that I'm telling you that you should have. Whereas don't trust the label, while that's still kind of a bit of a prescriptive command, it's inviting you to think like, should you trust the label? So hopefully it gave people the feeling that they can kind of think about it themselves and come to the conclusion themselves. So on to perceived practical barriers. The first is perceived necessity of exploiting animals. So we found in our research that perceived necessity is really strong influence on the perceived acceptability of different practices. So, for example, farming animals for food or testing on them in medical research are perceived as really necessary for human benefit and survival, and therefore generally accepted amongst the general population. In contrast, practices that are viewed as unnecessary are generally viewed quite as unacceptable. So examples that have come about in our research include wearing fur, testing on animals for cosmetic reasons, and hunting animals for sport. These sorts of practices are viewed as kind of like fulfilling kind of superficial human needs or frivolous needs, not needed for like survival or anything like that. And this like necessity narrative is actually really heavily leaned into by the advertising industry. So here's an ad from the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board. The message is basically the only way that you can have a healthy, tasty, well-rounded meal is with meat as like the center of the dish. And of course, a nice glass of milk on the side as well. And then we've also conducted some research looking at trying to quantify these things. So we asked participants their opinions about a range of standard farming practices. And we asked for each practice, could they rate how necessary they felt the practice was and how harmful they felt the practice was. And there was almost a one-to-one relationship between the two, with as the perceived necessity of a practice increased, the perceived harm decreased. And I think this kind of ties into what I was saying earlier about identity protection, that if you perceive a practice like farming animals as really necessary and you're culpable in that, in order to maintain your sense of self-worth, you need to kind of downplay how harmful you perceive that practice. So then the next barrier that we've kind of investigated is loss aversion. So this is a concept that's been studied really extensively in the psychological literature since the 70s. And it basically says that all else held equal, we're much more motivated by potential losses than we are by potential gains. So I'm going to show you a study, one of the many studies that have been conducted to measure this. So participants were split into two groups. The first group was handed a coffee mug and they were asked, how much would you be willing to sell this mug for? A second group were just shown the mug, they weren't handed the mug, and they were asked, how much would you be willing to buy it for? And so I'm hoping we could have a slight interactive bit now. I'm going to need Natalie to have a look at the chat. But if you could say which group would value the mug the highest, A or B, just to get a sense of your like intuition on this.
Got an A so far. Yep. Another A. Few A's rolled in. Yep. Most people saying A. Oh, got one B. But yeah, majority A's.
Cool. That's great. Okay, thank you. That's brilliant. Yeah, so if you said A, well done. They found that Group A valued the mug much higher than the participants in Group B. And if you think about it, like you've got the mug. So if you sell the mug for a potential gain of money, you risk losing the mug. In contrast, you have people in Group B, they haven't got anything, right? They've only got the potential gain of a mug and the potential loss of the money. So the power of loss aversion kind of overrides any gain. What's the word? What's the opposite of aversion?
Attraction.
Attraction. Yeah, thank you. And anyway, I think loss aversion plays quite an important role in animal freedom because, especially when people are buying animal-derived products, like I was saying earlier, people really value their freedom to choose, their personal choice, and there's a perception that they're going to lose out if they have to change their spending habits. Similarly, there's a perception that vegan diets are, bland, boring, and you're not going to basically be able to eat anything except for gruel. And what we've done is we've done some research to look at the effect of loss aversion on support for policy changes. So we asked one set of participants how much would they support a law which banned factory farming. And we found that 5 in 10 people would support such a law. However, another group were also asked the same question, but with the caveat that this would increase the cost of meat, dairy, and eggs and put strains on farmers. And we found that when the question is presented in this way, support goes down to 3 in 10. Similarly, we asked one group of participants, how much would you support a law which protects the rights of all animals in not being harmed, exploited, or killed? And in this case, 40% of people supported the law. However, when they were then reminded, or another group were reminded, that this would mean that we could no longer use animals for their meat, milk, eggs, or body parts for clothing, support dropped to 20%. So I think what this basically is telling us that loss aversion can have an effect on support for animal freedom, and that people, a significant number of people do support it in principle, up to the point that it affects their personal lives. So the final barrier that I'd like to talk about is perceived effectiveness of change. So I know I've had 2 kind of barriers per section, but there's just one here, and that is futility. Again, Pax Fauna's research, they interviewed people about eating animals for food, farming animals for food, and they found that people go through a series of stages. So first, they just avoid thinking about the issue altogether. But then when confronted with the issue, like kind of forced to sit down and think about it, they feel this dissonance, kind of what I spoke about earlier, this discomfort people feel about the reality. They then go through a series of rationalizations, trying to justify eating animals. And then finally, if they can't convince themselves with any of those rationalizations and accept, like, okay, maybe we should stop eating animals, they end up in a sense of futility. That is, well, things will never change, so it doesn't really matter what I do. Even if I did stop, others would continue eating meat anyway. But what they found was that using messaging along the theme of evolving together was actually really effective at getting people past this sense of futility. So, talking about like, well, you're not going to have to go vegan overnight. Society is changing. We're all going to evolve together. People felt that that was much more palatable. So, for example, one person said, because they specifically called it an evolution away from meat, they understood that it's going to be a process. It's going to take some time. It felt much more acceptable to them. And we've actually found similar results in our own work as well. So one series of experiments tested messaging which emphasized social progress. So that is that, we've expanded rights for other groups in the past, like women, people of color, and so on. And basically expanding rights for animals is just the next step in that evolution. And kind of emphasizing that like change is inevitable and going to happen. And basically, we found that people that read these types of messages show stronger support for animal freedom than people who didn't. Finally, I think also the way we present information has an effect on people's sense of futility. So in one study, we were interested in testing different factors of posters and people's responses to the posters. So we kind of had these images of like happy hens, like living nice lives, versus kind of unhappy hens living under cruel conditions. And we also created posters that kind of juxtaposed the two. And what we found was that kind of the happy imagery had very little effect on people's motivation to support the movement. The imagery of kind of unhappy hens did have an effect. It did increase people's support. But the most effective images were ones which juxtaposed the two together in the same poster. And I think this is because you can see the unhappy hens, you can see the cruel conditions, and that will motivate people to do something or to change their attitudes. But by showing the kind of happy hens as well alongside it, it gives them an out. Like there's no sense to feel futile, like, oh, there's a reason to actually do something about this. So I just want to say like this model is like a work in progress. As with everything in science, it's always evolving, and we are thinking about different ways, different things that might be included in the model, which is going to need further testing. So there's the us-them divide between humans and animals. Individualism has been shown to be a barrier in other contexts, as well as where people are in their own personal journey. So someone who maybe has never like considered this issue is probably going to hit the barriers much earlier on, maybe at the psychological level. Whereas perhaps someone who spent some time considering it might now be stuck at the kind of perceived practical barriers. And then finally, maybe something like self-efficacy, which is your sense that you can do something. So kind of under that perceived effectiveness of change, do people believe that they themselves can change? So this is all like future research. With all that in mind, I just want to do a sort of analysis from the perspective of this model of the Go Vegan message. So the Go Vegan message is kind of our dominant message in the movement. But we're not sure, is it working as intended? So firstly, from the perspective of this model, just the phrase go vegan, it's a command, right? Does it create agency threat that we talked about? You've probably heard people say things like, who are you to tell me what to do? Or you should respect my personal choice, or even that vegans are preachy. This could be a response to that sense of agency threat. Similarly, go vegan kind of implies that the audience, you, are the problem. That change, the only way to kind of solve this big problem is through individuals changing their personal behaviors. So, does it create a sense of identity threat? If someone feels like they're being told that they are the problem, it's going to create cognitive dissonance. And therefore, in order to protect one's positive self-image, maybe it's easier to reject the message. Additionally, vegan itself is an identity. Some people might view vegans like this as these kind of radical people carrying signs into restaurants and disrupting people's days. How can you be told to just have an identity that you don't have? Additionally, yeah, like vegans are kind of like a vilified minority, like I mentioned earlier. So do people really want to identify with them? Perhaps it's safer just to stick with the majority. So I'm wondering, do we need a new movement message in addition to Go Vegan? I don't have any suggestions yet. I'm interested to hear what people think, but based on our research, maybe these are some things we should consider. So firstly, our messages should probably not be a command. We need to allow people to come to their own conclusions. Perhaps it should be phrased as a question. It should not frame the audience as the villain. perhaps we should frame the system or greedy corporations as the villain. Like I mentioned earlier, this is ongoing research, and hopefully we'll have some better ideas soon for the next webinar, maybe. Um, we also want people to want to join, to move towards our side. We want them to see that change means joining a group that they would like to be a part of. So we could appeal to their aspirational identities, like who do they want to be? Could it be animal lovers, like we mentioned earlier? Alternatively, we could just avoid the prickly problem of identity altogether and appeal to people's values that they already have. And I think we can use loss aversion to our advantage. So we can emphasize what we stand to lose as a society if we don't change, as well as showing that if we do change, any losses are going to be minimal and vastly outweighed by the benefits. And finally, not finally, sorry, and that change is necessary, and that, we will be better off for changing, and that fundamentally exploiting animals is unnecessary, and that we need to challenge futility. So we need to show that kind of change is inevitable and it's happening right now, and kind of pose to people the question, do you want to be part of the solution? So that brings me to the end. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to use the QR codes to visit our site, LinkedIn, blog, or newsletter. And yeah, I welcome any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, got lots of questions coming in, and some people are making suggestions as well for potential messages we could try. So definitely ones we could test, Rob. So one is Claire Bass suggested maybe something like, "Are you ready to be part of the plant-based revolution?" So that could be one worth testing. And it kind of reminds me of yeah, kind of framings and messages they used in the Truth campaign, the kind of anti-tobacco campaign, where this was specifically aimed at younger people, and they had messages like, "We will be the generation that ends smoking." So it was really positive, and it was this idea of group identity. So yeah, I think you could be onto something there, Claire. Definitely worth testing. Melda had the suggestion of try vegan rather than go vegan. So I guess that's not so much an identity. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Rob, that idea of try vegan.
I think that could probably be better. That would theoretically, that would be more effective than go vegan. I have a pretty strong feeling that just the word vegan is enough to put people off. Because even when we try to say, like, I'm not telling you to go vegan, I'm just saying you've got values that align with vegans, people are like, oh, get away from me. I think there's also research that just being in the presence of a vegan is enough to elicit cognitive dissonance. So, yeah, it's a tricky one.
Kind of with that in mind, Rob, do you want to speak briefly to some of the segmentation research, the kind of big narrative research project we'll have coming up next year that might address some of these things, finding out, some things might resonate for some types of people, but not others?
Yeah, so we're going to be, you'll have to cover for me if I forget anything, but we're going to be doing a big research project on samples in the UK and the US, trying to figure out, what are the different kind of psychological profiles of people with regards to kind of animal ethics and plant-based dieting. So are there certain types of people, certain traits or personalities that make people more receptive to particular messaging? Yeah, like we haven't done the research yet, but I imagine, for example, talking to someone who's like on the right side of the political spectrum, appealing to their sense of like responsibility might be more effective. Something like that. Yeah. What have I
Yeah.
missed?
Yeah, no, that's it. I think, yeah, really kind of finding out who are those groups of people, what are the kind of shared traits, how we can tailor communications that most resonate for them, and also find out where are people kind of receiving kind of their communications most, who are their trusted messengers. So just giving us like more of a laser focus as a movement. And it's also, you know, kind of a baseline that we can continue testing and seeing if certain kind of segments are growing and others are reducing as, you know, society and conditions change. Someone else has shared, Natalie, veganism, as I understand it, isn't the end goal, but otherwise the means or the vehicle to a compassionate world. It's a living philosophy, but the end goal is compassion. So maybe something along the lines of compassion. So I don't know if you want to speak a bit to kind of testing around values, Rob.
Yeah, totally. I agree with the first part. Like when everyone's vegan, like there won't be such thing. There won't be like the term won't exist. Like there won't be any vegans because yeah. Um, we did do some testing around values, but maybe we need to do more testing. And if I remember rightly, we actually didn't find anything. Wasn't any effect of the messages.
Yeah, it's something
But
we definitely need to dive into
yeah,
next.
but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means maybe that we didn't have the right messages. I don't
Yeah.
know. At least they didn't weren't counterproductive.
No. And one thing we do want to test more, I don't know if anyone's kind of heard from values-based research, this kind of tactic of benevolence pivot. So getting people to think benevolently about another group. So, you know, in our context, it might be getting people to think about their animal family members or, you know, say on Mother's Day, getting them to think about their own mother or their child and then getting them to pivot and then think about other animals. So it's kind of putting them in a position where they're connecting with helpful, benevolent values. And then it kind of reduces cognitive dissonance. So that's been shown to be the case across many different campaigns and contexts. And it's something we'd like to test in various contexts as well. Vanessa has asked, Rob, do you have any information about appealing to reason versus emotion, i.e. it makes sense to go plant-based versus follow your heart and save animals, choose compassion? I guess you could speak a bit to Pax Fauna's research around trust
Mm,
your emotions.
yeah, I'm just thinking, I think, yeah, they found a few things that's relevant to that. So yeah, the first thing was trust your emotions, which was they kind of again, it's that thing about not being prescriptive. They found when they asked people to trust their emotions, like, how do you actually feel about it? If your emotions are telling you this isn't right, then maybe your emotions are right on this issue. And I think we did some messages along those lines, and they were effective as well. Like with regards to morality.
Mm.
They also found that including a citation makes people trust the message more, even if it's like, even if people don't check the citation, you just have to include the citation, and people are like, oh, I believe it. And I think it can, and a lot of feedback they received as well. I think we've received the similar feedback, which is, oh, give it, yeah, like, you know, give us some stats or give us some like evidence. And I think people want to believe that they're analytical and rational. But like, yeah, 60 years of psychology shows that we really aren't. And actually, we're a lot more heavily influenced by emotion and kind of these secondary characteristics, like someone's how charismatic someone is a lot more influential than what they actually say. Um, and I think a lot of like people that have become vegan have done so through empathy. And I like when I've talked to people, like not in a rigorous way or anything, but just kind of conversations like at the office or whatever, it seems to be like the way I came to veganism was kind of through the rational way method of like the philosophical arguments, but that doesn't seem to be like the standard route. Most people come to it through um the like emotional route, but I don't know.
And
I
also,
think I'm
Rob,
waffling now.
no, but you've also kind of spoken about the grief you felt as well, right, Rob? So it's like
Mm,
definitely an emotional connection. So,
that's
and I guess it's
true.
a thing of like, you know, one size doesn't fit all, and there's probably a bit of both that's needed. But yeah, we definitely are emotional creatures, aren't we?
Mm.
Um, Yeah, so Vanessa said to lead with emotion and sprinkle with some reason as well, which yeah, sounds
Yeah.
good. Um, so Andrea from Funalytics, she said, super interesting. Just have some comments I have for food for thought. So the evolved together messaging by Pax Fauna and the social progress comparisons message study ran are consistent with the idea of dynamic norms being more
Mm,
effective for messaging than static norms. So people are open to trying new things when they find out other people are doing it. So I
mm.
guess that idea of kind of social proof as well. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Rob, before I move on to Andrew's second point.
Yeah, it's so true. Like we don't yeah, we decide what's right and wrong by just looking at what everyone else is doing. So that kind of, there's these four ends of like eating meat is normal, natural, necessary, and nice. Like we need to find ways of making the plant-based the norm and not the alternative, or just making it look like the norm. Doesn't, make it look like the norm and then it will be the norm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of brings in that idea as well of like law, because we've kind of found that in focus groups and interviews, and people are like, well, this is legal. And yeah,
Mm,
it's just that idea of, well, if you change what's legal, that kind of changes the norm. And, change the norm, that can then change what's legal. And then Andrea's second point was there's research that people are more likely to eat less meat after seeing a reducitarian message than a go vegan message, which is
mm.
interesting. So for anyone who's interested in being that, Andrew's put the Funalytics link in the chat there.
Oh, thanks for
Um,
sharing.
yeah, so let me see. We've got lots more other questions. I wonder if you want to stop sharing your screen, Rob, so you can see
Yeah.
people's faces a bit more. So we'll go for about another 10 minutes, and then for those who are able to stay on, we'll stop recording, and then yeah, we'll open up the space for people to share their thoughts more openly. So yes, Uma said loads of points really resonate with what we've noticed in the animal testing research community too. So that's really great to hear. So another question from Claire, great insights. Just wondered if you looked at specific messages that could resonate with animal companion owners, as this could be a receptive access point for people to recognize and feel inspired to take action to address that inconsistency of loving some animals but eating others. So inviting people to expand their circle
Mm.
of compassion could be good. So you're saying they're already good, but could be even better.
Yes, I think that is like a demographic we have thought about targeting, isn't it? Like they're kind of primed to, strategically we've thought about, oh, campaigns that are related to dogs or cats or something. And then once they are mobilized on that, then expanding. I'm trying to think. We did test some like animal lover, like you're an animal lover message, but it was kind of just sent out to everybody. And there wasn't a strong effect there. But again, it's like that's just like one study. Um, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Natalie?
Sorry, I was distracted by things in the chat, so I wasn't fully following.
Yeah, we
But
haven't really looked at messages that could resonate with animal companion owners, but I imagine they would be a good segment to target, and that might be something that comes out in the segmentation research that we're going to do.
yeah, I mean, we have done qualitative research where we did recruitment with people who had, animal family members. And that's kind of, yeah, we're doing ongoing analysis. And we, yeah, kind of did, well, I mean, it's hard to make kind of blanket statements at the moment, but there definitely seem to be some distinctions between groups that where people did have animal family members and groups that didn't, but nothing kind of concrete. We're still doing analysis around that. But yeah, I think that is a really helpful like inroad for us as a movement because yeah, I heard a statistic the other day that people having animal family members has gone up to I think about 60% in the UK since
Hmm.
the pandemic. I mean, obviously that's not great news either, but just that people are identifying as someone who does love animals. So definitely yeah, something we should be using more as a movement, I think. Another comment from Helen. So some of the distinction between what is helpful and what's not is very subtle. So aligning animal oppression with human oppressions and other isms puts up barriers. So we definitely kind of found that in both our quantitative and our qualitative research, whereas recognizing society's progress in improving rights for oppressed groups is positive. So it's closely linked. Could it be because the second appeals to the collective and makes people less of a villain on an individual level?
Yeah, I think that is likely the answer. Um, it's also a really big challenge because so when we do these message testing studies, like we'll come up with a narrative like social progress and then design like 4 or 5 messages that kind of tap into that. And each one will be like 100 words long. And sometimes, one message will work, another won't, and another will just like be counter effective. And it's very difficult because in those 100 or so words, like there's so many variables that can affect a person's attitude, like the things you're saying. So it's kind of, yeah, I guess over the course of like doing lots and lots of testing, we can kind of pull out these themes, I guess. Um, but yeah, I think appealing to like, yeah, the collective is changing and it's not on your shoulders to change and save the world, definitely.
Yeah, and we do want to do a lot more testing around kind of individual calls to action and kind of individual change compared to more systemic level change. So this idea of changing the conditions, creating the conditions for people to live more in line with their values. So yeah, we'll have results on that soon. I see your hand, Liz. I'm going to come to you soon. We've just got a few more minutes of the recording and then we're going to open up the space and then I'll unmute everyone. Yeah, interesting comment from Jeannie. She says, how do we help fellow vegans support our messaging? I get lots of pushback whenever I couch something with a plant-based messaging versus using the word vegan. Do you
So
want to
is
speak
that like pushback from
from other
vegan?
vegans? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we're kind of thinking of. Do we, yeah, I mean, it's a big ongoing discussion. Like, can we reclaim what vegan means as a movement? I mean, other movements have done this, right?
Mm,
And can it be seen more as, for example, like an act of solidarity rather than a
mm,
diet change or an
mm,
individual choice? Can it kind of we bring back the kind of almost political element of it? Or do we need to kind of just shift and use a different frame? Yeah, if anyone, we can open that question maybe up in the chat in a few minutes. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Another question from Natalia. I was wondering, how would you say is the best conduct regarding communications with companies? So Natalia works as a campaigns analyst, and does know what wants to know what would be the more effective strategies to launch public campaigns, pressuring them to have accountability regarding their commitments.
No, that is a big question.
Yeah,
I honestly don't know. I feel like that's a little bit outside my
yeah.
expertise.
Yeah, I guess we've been focusing more on kind of public opinion shift, but yeah, I think it's really yeah, kind of tailoring your communications to different audiences because I mean business owners obviously their main focus is I guess like the bottom line, like money, but then it's we shouldn't disregard the fact that these are people who also
Mm,
have emotions and morals and we can still connect with people via intrinsic values as well as
mm.
their kind of business needs as well. But yeah, would love to hear how you got on with that, Natalia. And yeah, I mean, this is something we'd like to expand into, but there's so much research and not enough time. But yeah, thanks for raising that. And then yeah, Liz has made a point, and maybe you can speak to this in a moment, Liz. Like most of the long-term vegans I've come in contact with over the past 14 years go vegan for emotional reasons of compassion, but it's a tiny percentage of the population. I'm wondering if the same message that caused people to be long-term vegans does not work for the majority of the population, or perhaps it's because the movement is so underfunded that we don't reach enough people. Questions to ponder.
Mm.
So another one we could perhaps open up in the chat. So yeah, given we're kind of almost at the 5:30 mark, I think I'll stop recording there and would really love it if people could stay on and we can yeah, open up this discussion more, because like I said, I know there's a lot of people on this call who are doing research and have many insights to share as well.